So the subtitle is basically, that this is just some sort of an excuse to maybe tell you a little bit about what the structure of loop quantum gravity is. So what I'll do in this talk is motivate and display a new classical Poisson bracket identity concerning the dynamics of general relativity. While the identity is classical, the motivation for this identity, motivation to search for this identity comes from certain considerations in the loop quantum gravity approach. So most of the talk will be basically to provide a quick review of LQG, because I thought that may be interesting for most people who are not familiar with this field. And just a brief summary of the logical structure of the talk. So GR is a generally covariant theory, and in any generally covariant theory, if you look at the Hamiltonian formulation, since gauge transformations are entwined with dynamics, can you hear me? Or is this? The evolution is generated by constraints, and the Hamiltonian constraint generates dynamics normal to the three-dimensional spatial slice, and then the spatial diffeomorphism constraints generates dynamics parallel to the slice. In loop quantum gravity, we have good control over the spatial diffeomorphisms, and the construction of the Hamiltonian constraint operator, which generates the non-trivial dynamics of the theory, is the key open issue at present. And the new identity relates the Poisson bracket between a pair of Hamiltonian constraints to the Poisson bracket between a pair of diffeomorphism constraints, and then suggests certain avenues for progress towards defining the Hamiltonian constraint operator in loop quantum gravity. So this is the plan of the talk. I'll first review the Hamiltonian formulation of GR, because it may be perhaps unfamiliar to some of you. And then I'll go and perform a change of variables, and that will be the classical starting point for a canonical quantization approach, a particular approach which is known as loop quantum gravity. I'll then provide a review of the basic elements of this approach, and then slightly digress to discuss what I mean by space-time covariance, and from there proceed to display the new identity. So feel free to stop me if there are any questions. So let me start by reviewing what the Hamiltonian approach is to general relativity, what the Hamiltonian formulation is of general relativity. So of course, in the space-time equations, I'll just restrict to the vacuum equations for convenience and simplicity in this talk. So you have a space-time, four-dimensional space-time manifold M and some Lorentzian metric on it, GAB, and then you have the Einstein equations, which is just the Einstein tensor vanishes on this four-dimensional manifold. If you want to go to the Hamiltonian formulation, then you have to look at the same equations as evolution equations, and so you need to be in a situation where you can split space-time into space and time. And so the Hamiltonian formulation is only definable when you have so-called globally hyperbolic spacetimes, which have the topology sigma cross R. So here I've shown you this split of space-time into space and time. So these are the Cauchy slices over here. Your three-dimensional slice is sigma, and there is a time vector field along which these slices and the data on them evolve. So if I just focus on one particular slice, I have this slice over here, I have a time vector field over here. The induced metric from the space-time metric on this spatial slice, I'll just call QAB, and the basic variables of the Hamiltonian formulation are QAB and its velocity along the time direction. And of course, as in usual Hamiltonian formulations, one can trade the velocity for a momenta, and one has the canonical Poisson brackets where Q and P are canonically conjugate. Q is just the pullback of the space-time metric, and so it defines the intrinsic geometry of the spatial slice, and P, it turns out, is related to how this slice is curved in the ambient space-time GAB, and so it controls the extrinsic geometry of sigma in the manifold M. It's useful to decompose this time flow vector field into components which are normal to the slice, normal with respect to this metric GAB, so this is the unit normal little n, and the remaining, which is just the tangential direction to the slice. So you can, I'm sorry. Okay, so over here, n is called the lapse, and the tangent vector to the slice is called the shift. The Hamiltonian density which evolves, so you are given initial data q and p on the slice, and the Hamiltonian density which evolves u normal to the slice is called the scalar Hamiltonian constraint. And if you want to evolve along n times little n, that is with a lapse n, then you just integrate this over the 3 manifold. The Hamiltonian density for evolution tangential to the slice, so there are of course 3 of them, we are in 3 dimensions, and these are called the vector diffeomorphism constraints. And again, given a shift, a tangential direction along which you want to evolve, you just integrate this with respect to the shift. So putting this together, evolution along the time vector field is then just given by the Poisson bracket between the variables of interest with the combination of the Hamiltonian and the diffeomorphism constraints. So this is roughly speaking half the content of the Einstein equations. The other half of the Einstein equations constrain the initial values of q and p, and they're constrained simply by demanding that the scalar constraint, this particular combination, vanishes, and the vector constraints also vanish. So once you have these constraints satisfied, together with these evolution equations, you can also show that the evolution equations maintain the constraints if they are satisfied at some initial time. So these things together are completely equivalent to the Einstein equations T equal to 0. In other words, if you have a solution to these guys, so you start out with qx0, px0, and then you just solve the equations in time, then from this you can go back and you can reconstruct a solution GAB on the 4-dimensional manifold, where x is some 3-dimensional coordinate and t is time. And this is a solution to the Einstein equations. And if one wants to change the direction of time flow, you can do that by changing how much in the normal direction, how much in the tangential direction you move, so that you can change n and na, these are like Lagrange multipliers. And one can get this, one can solve the equations and one can check that what you get for the space-time geometry is the same. So let me now discuss the change of variables. So it's convenient for what I want to say later to, instead of the 3 metric, use a triplet of orthonormal fields. So the GR convention is that the letter A is a tangent space index and I is just labels the internal index, so it's just which particular member of the triplet I'm considering. So I goes from 1 to 3 and EI is this triplet. And of course this triplet squares to just give you the 3 metric. So this contains the information about the 3 metric. If one takes a rotation, an internal rotation of this triplet of fields, then of course you get the same metric. And so under such internal rotations, the little index I transforms as an SO3 Lie algebra valued index, or equivalently an SU2 Lie algebra valued index. And so this is nothing but a spatial SU2 Yang-Mills electric field. And it's no surprise that the conjugate variable, if you try to complete the canonical transformation, is an SU2 connection. So these are canonically conjugate now. And the connection contains all the information about the extrinsic curvature, the variable P in the earlier formulation. So due to this triad rotation, there are of course extra degrees of freedom in the pair EA relative to the pair QP, and one can ensure that these are completely equivalent by further imposing that this rotation is actually gauge, and that's just by imposing the Gauss law constraint, where D is just the gauge covariant derivative. So that basically this pair plus these constraints together are equivalent to the earlier description. And finally, one can express the remaining constraints, namely the Hamiltonian and the diffeomorphism constraints in terms of these new variables, D and A, and one gets certain expressions. So this is the formulation I'm going to take to jump to now to the quantum theory. So the particular approach I'm interested in is loop quantum gravity, and this is a canonical quantization approach based on the phase space description in terms of electric fields and connections. So in any canonical quantization approach, these are the basic steps. You choose a set of functions on your phase space such that they separate points on your phase space. You represent each function as an operator on some Hilbert space of wave functions in such a way that the Poisson brackets between the functions go to commutators divided by h bar. And if you can do this in a nice way, then you have the quantum kinematics of the theory. And you want Then go and construct the quantum correspondence of the generators of evolution. And if you can do this well, then you have the quantum dynamics of the theory. And of course, one would like to choose the quantum kinematics so that there is a higher chance of it supporting the quantum dynamics. So here I have functions of connections and functions of the electric field. So what are these basic functions which I start out with? The basic connection dependent functions are associated with edges and are just, they're called holonomies, which I'm sure all of you are familiar from lattice gauge theory. So here I have an edge in the spatial manifold sigma, and you have some path ordered exponential in some representation of SU2, and this is the holonomy. So since A is in the Lie algebra, H is just an SU2 matrix, and so you have, an SU2 matrix worth of functions of the connection A, and you consider all possible edges in this manifold sigma, and thereby you get an overcomplete set of functions, H, and if I specify all the H's for all edges, then I can reconstruct the connection A. No, they're just any edges, so technically you require certain differentiability and analyticity properties of the edges, but basically they're just what are called semi-analytic edges. They're just any edges, one-dimensional submanifolds, which are appropriately smooth lying in sigma. Okay. So all possible edges. At this stage, there's no triangulation, there's no nothing over here. So in lattice gauge theory, you'll consider maybe a particular latticization of your manifold. Here, one is not doing that. You have a manifold sigma, right, that is given to you in the Hamiltonian formulation. Right? You consider any one-dimensional submanifold, right, which is closed, and then and then certain more technical definitions about differentiability of this, and that's an edge. Yeah. No. So no. It just says that the canonical variables in which you can look at, in which you can formulate GR are also canonical variables of Yang-Mills, right? But in Yang-Mills, you would have a different dynamics. You'd have a different Hamiltonian. Over here, you have the same variables, but you have the dynamics of GR. So that's the only statement, that the variables look the same, but yeah, on the E's, but remember these are spatial gauge transformations. On the E's and the A's, they transform, the E's are, they are gauge covariant, so they rotate, and the A's transform as an SU2 connection, right? Right. So you'd have to compute, in a particular gauge, you can compute, so you give me a slicing of the short-shelled solution with some, you'll have some metric data and some extrinsic curvature data. From there, you will have to pick for me an orthonormal frame, a three-dimensional orthonormal frame. Okay. Now, associated to this three-dimensional orthonormal frame, so I may not complete what I want to say, but that's all right. I'd much rather answer questions and so on. So given this three-dimensional orthonormal frame, there is, maybe all of this so just stop me, right? So there is something which is called, there's a unique connection which is called the spin connection, which annihilates this guy. So let me call that spin connection. So if I choose some background coordinate operator, then I have some spin connection over here. Right. So yeah, exactly. So you give me this short shell space time. I give you, there's a slice over here, right? And I choose some data E, which squares, right? So EAI, EBI squares to give me whatever metric data is there, right? Corresponding to whatever choice of E I make, I can define this object, which is a spin connection. Yeah. This is the three metric. This is three metric, and then there's also the extrinsic curvature, right? So there is also with this, the other half of the data, which is the extrinsic curvature, which I can just write as some KAB. You can reconstruct P from K. And now, I define, if you give me the extrinsic curvature, I can form this quantity, okay? And I can, this just transforms covariantly by rotation. So if I add this to the spin connection, this also transforms as a connection, and this connection is my, what I call my connection A. And you can check that this is a canonical transformation going from, with all the steps which I described. Yeah, so the A's have, if you want to look at them in terms of the data, so remember, this data is probably familiar to you, right? This is just the ADM data, the metric and the extrinsic curvature. Now from here, I have to choose some triad, which squares to give me the Q's. So I have to recapture the information in the extrinsic curvature somehow. Okay? So how do I do that? That information is contained in this connection A. And the connection has a part which is directly constructed from the extrinsic curvature and the triad, and another part which gives its kind of connection transformation, which is just a spin connection associated to E. No, these are independent, right. So so this is a phase space coordinatization. Just like you give me any data, he asked on shell because he asked about the Schwarzschild solution. So for the Schwarzschild solution, you choose a slice, I'll get some specific Q and I'll get some specific K, and from there I can construct the specific some E and I can construct the A. But of course, if I look at all of GR, then the phase space is just coordinatized by Q's and K's, and here the same phase space is coordinatized here by E's and A's. Right, no, so there is a Lagrangian for this. It goes by the name of the Holst Lagrangian, which is where, and so there is a Lagrangian which gives you the GR covariant equations, and whose decomposition then gives you the canonical variables over here. So you can also go at it. So you can go to this in two ways. One is you can first do the usual ADM decomposition, right? Where again these Q's and K's are not four-dimensional covariant variables, they're just three-dimensional covariant variables. And from here you can make a canonical transformation to these guys. Or you can directly construct an action which gives you the four-dimensional equations of GR and do a 3+1 decomposition on them and get this initial wave. So, sure. Right. Well, horizon, just the same. So this is nothing. Those sort of questions do not add any layer beyond what is already happening with canonical ADM data. Right. Well, a horizon, what you can do is, so there are two things. One is that this has nothing to do with your choice of canonical variables. Okay, I can either tell you in terms of E's and A's or Q's and P's. Okay, so this question which you have pertains to just how in canonical theory do you see a horizon. Right? So yeah. Yeah, you can just translate, right, exactly. Not necessarily. Again, there are, okay, so that's a kind of a whole different discussion. I can just tell you a couple of lines, we can talk about it a little later, okay. So, as Suvrat said, for a general horizon, there's no way you can do, even from the canonical data, you don't know how to, predict where an event horizon is going to form because it's teleological, right? What you can do is work with apparent horizons and ask for, trapped surfaces and where they form, etc. Within the class of these apparent horizons, there are certain horizons which capture the notion of no matter falling in. And these are called isolated horizons. If you look at these isolated horizons, then it turns out that there is a kind of a nice condition between the E's and the A's, which you can write down. That I will have to look at some, yeah, it's basically that, it's something which relates the, this is going a little bit away out of the things, but it's basically, you take from two of these E's, right, you can form something which has an antisymmetric index, and it relates essentially this guy to the pullback of the curvature of the A's, just on that surface. So it's one can go back and see what it is. But this is called the isolated horizon boundary condition. No. So yeah, no, it doesn't look like that. Okay, so there is some history to this thing, which is when this, and one would like to finally get back to what was the historical circumstance. So I think Abhay Ashtekar was just looking at self-dual solutions to the Lorentzian equations, and he found that if you actually look at connections which are given not real connections, but actually complex connections, okay, where there's an I over here, and these triads, then it turns out that the constraints of GR take a very, very simple form. So you have the Gauss constraint, which is what I said. The diffeomorphism constraint actually doesn't matter whether things are complex or real. That just looks like the first simple thing you could construct. And the Hamiltonian constraint looks like the second simple thing you can construct. With the structure constant, where FAB is the curvature of this guy. Okay, but I mean, if this was so-called Euclidean gravity with a Euclidean signature, then we didn't need the I, and this would still be the constraints. But for Lorentzian gravity with these real variables, you have certain other terms which don't look that great, but which you can handle in, there's some suggestions how to handle them in quantum theory. The problem with these complex guys is it's very difficult to know what to do with them in quantum theory, because you have non-compact things happening and so on and so forth. But yes, the whole hope is that once you know enough about this messy thing with the real variables, that someday you will go back to the self-dual variables and try and reformulate the quantum theory in terms of them. And it's really in terms of the self-dual variables that a lot of beautiful things happen, including the isolated horizon boundary condition. So then you do something more to it, and then I can't remember. I think it's not as pretty as the self-dual relation. F, the sigma equal to F is more like the self-dual variables. So, but those are things we can, yeah. Right. Once you add matter, then you just, you just add matter, right? And then you just work out what the couplings are. And, yeah. Yeah. Right. So what? Yeah. So that will be apparent in the next. What it's got us is basically a rigorous construction of the way spatial diffeomorphisms act in the theory, and you're able to solve the diffeomorphism constraint. So let me just come to that in a minute. And that's not, we don't know how to do that rigorously in the Wheeler-DeWitt case. One can, actually in hindsight, one can do something with that as well. But then going on to the Hamiltonian constraint, and actually this identity you will see would be the final identity. I don't know whether I'll have time to get to that at all. But that identity cannot be written in terms of these metric and extrinsic curvature variables. They rely crucially on the use of triads and connections. Yeah, let's go on, and then I don't know whether I'll be able to finish. But please stop me, I'm quite happy to discuss. Okay, so so where was I? I was over here, right? So these are the connection-dependent functions, which are the holonomies. And similarly, one can write down fluxes through surfaces in the manifold sigma. And these are the electric field-dependent functions. And as you can see, for example, explicitly for the holonomies are just covectors, right? On the spatial transformations as covectors. And so this is going to come and hit the tangent vector to the edge. And this object does not involve any background metric in its construction. So you just give me a connection, I can find its holonomy. Similarly, because these electric fields are actually density-weighted electric fields, it turns out that their fluxes also do not require any background metric for their construction. So this is just data and nothing else. You don't have to put in a fixed flat background or anything of the sort. You just write down this algebra. It's naturally defined. And now we come to the quantum kinematics. So you have, it turns out, you have basically what you want to do is to construct a representation of the Poisson bracket algebra between the holonomies and electric fluxes. And this representation is essentially a connection representation. So wave functions are functions, wave functions are functions of the connection, and connection dependent operators act by multiplication, and triad dependent operators act by functional differentiation. And of course, for our case of interest, there are the holonomies and G's are the fluxes. So this looks very formal, but you can actually make all of this rigorous, and you can construct a diffeomorphism invariant measure on the space of connections, for which these holonomy and flux operators satisfy the correct adjointness conditions coming from their reality properties in the classical theory. So maybe this is really one of the sort of key results. This measure was constructed by Oeschtecker and Isham and Lewandowski and so on. And the measure also, just like in say free scalar field theory or something, the configuration space of scalar fields is enlarged, right? They become, in fact, the Fock measure is actually concentrated on so-called tempered distributions, not just smooth scalar fields. Actually a set of measures 0 in the Fock measure. So similarly here, there's an enlargement, a huge enlargement of the classical configuration space of smooth or whatever semi-analytic connections. And on this space, you can construct this measure, and this measure is diffeomorphism invariant. So because of this, yeah. Yeah, in the linearized theory, relying on the flat metric, your background flat metric, you can construct the usual Fock type of measure, and that's fine. But that is for the linearized theory in which you have a background flat metric structure, which you use actively over here, right? And the linearized theory, you'll have linearized diffeomorphisms, etc. So here I'm talking about the full theory, where you'd like full diffeomorphisms to act unitarily on your space of wave functions. And for this, you don't have any, the moment you bring in any outside flat metric or anything at all, then it's something which will not move covariantly with the diffeomorphism. So if that sneaks into the construction of your Hilbert space, then you can't do this. Right. Right. So that is a naive measure, and you have to. Well, it doesn't actually exist. There are folklore theorems which, before this measure was found, the folklore theorems showing that no such measure actually exists on the space of metrics. These are infinite dimensional issues, basically. Right. So in a path integral, I mean, what you usually do is, well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of things start off with Gaussian measures and then you add on. Of course, there are other things you do, but by and large, that's what you do. In this case, you don't, I mean, Gaussian with respect to what, right? There is no flat metric structure at all. You can, I mean, there is no way to write down. So in the linearized theory, I completely agree. You can construct that Gaussian measure and you can get going. But in the full nonlinear theory, I don't know any way of constructing from an actual rigorous diffeomorphism invariant measure, even in the path integral scenario. Yeah. Right. Well, this measure is more akin to lattice gauge theory measures, but it's not exactly the lattice gauge theory measure. It derives from the Haar measure on SU2, which doesn't require any metric, which is just there. And somehow you glue these for all possible lattices, and you get some infinite dimensional measure over here. Yeah, gauge transformations. Yeah, I mean, this is actually also a gauge invariant measure, but it's a gauge invariant and diffeomorphism invariant measure. Right. Right. So is that on some background space-time, or how do you do it? Or is it just on full, full? Right. 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 Yeah. So right. So this is several steps ahead, right? We are still at the case where this. Remember, I'm still talking about quantum kinematics. Okay. Dynamical issues are still to be tackled. Right. Right. You give me a wave function of 3 metrics. I mean, of in that case 3 metrics, right? And right. You can compute it, and it will. Okay. So let me understand the question. Right. Yeah, the problem I'm having is how to connect this up to the earlier proposed, or whatever calculation with, de Sitter and fluctuations about de Sitter. Because here I'll have to look first. Yeah. Okay, that I forget. Forget about that. Okay. Yeah, then I can just compute something. Sure. Yeah, well, the problem is that in that case, I have to separate, fluctuations from a background, as I understand it, right? Otherwise, right? So in this language, it becomes much more complicated because I have to look for some semi-classical states which are peaked on whatever background you supply for me. And then in that state, I look for fluctuations of certain variables. And the construction of semi-classical states is itself kind of a thorny issue, which also impinges on other things. So I can just compute some, I can pick a state, which is like the spin network states or something, and I can just go ahead and compute something. But this is one of the big problems in LQG, because you don't start out with a background, it has to come out of the theory in terms of appropriate states. And this is also, I mean, there are various proposals how to do this, but it's by no means settled. Right. So in the linearized theory, I have no problem, but yeah. In the linearized theory. So the problem is, I'm talking about, so I can of course take the linearized theory and I can study coherent states in the linearized theory. No problem, because I understand. Here one can generate a notion of coherent states, but like there are a lot of other structures which go into coherent state. Depends how you define coherent states. So one way of defining coherent states, requires a positive negative frequency decomposition. Then you look at eigenfunctions of the, annihilation operator. But positive negative frequency decomposition requires a particular sense of time. Right. So here you don't have that. So it's very difficult to compare, and that's why this thing is still at, so there are these open questions which, but conceptually, at least I hope I. Right. Right. So yeah, there are. Yeah. So actually, this is the big problem. One does not know. This is an open problem. One does not know how to make contact back with classical GR. So that is a big problem, and it is a problem. There are proposals, right? But these proposals then they depend on people's choices and so on. And I don't want to defend them, or it's an open problem. Okay. So what I can tell you what can be done, Subrat. I mean, what you can do is not really LQG, but it is kind of LQG inspired, which is, so here it's tough to get backgrounds and so on. You'll see, actually I'm only a third into the talk. You'll see that there are many open problems over here. And but what you can do is the following. What you can do is you can first restrict to a mini superspace situation where you switch off all inhomogeneous anisotropic degrees of freedom, you can look at the kind of representations one chooses in full LQG and the kind of treatment of the dynamics, etc., which one does in full LQG, and one can repeat that, but it's not a derivation. One is repeating, certain mathematical things which you do in full LQG and trying to, there are certain quantization choices, representation choices, etc., which you make for the mini superspace. You can quantize it, you get interesting results, singularity resolution, etc. But then what you can do is you can treat the rest of the stuff, inhomogeneities and anisotropies, as perturbations on this quantum space-time, which you obtain via the mini superspace approximation. So those fluctuations can be treated as perturbation. In perturbation theory, the only okay, fine. So let's only do mini superspace. Right. So what happens in the Dewitt and right. So from here, what happens, for example, if you do Wheeler-Dewitt quantization of, say, FRW with, say, a master scalar field or something. So there you find that as you go back in time, and I can tell you what this time is, basically use the scalar field as a clock, you inevitably reach a singularity, even in the quantum theory. Whereas in this quantization, you actually get a resolution of the singularity and you bounce. So the universe goes to small sizes when the density of the scalar field becomes Planckian, the local energy density, and then you bounce. And the more interesting thing is when you also put in inhomogeneities, etc., and treat them perturbatively, and then you can try and see whether there is actually any, whether if you put boundary conditions on the states at the bounds, etc., whether you can say anything about sort of large-scale CMBR things, etc. This is happening. Yeah, the representation is very, very different. So the representation of which one chooses is a completely non-Fock representation. It's not a Fock representation at all. And I can divert this whole talk and also, no, I'm very happy to do it. I can also talk about what sort of representations one uses in the mini superspace case. So they are kind of, okay, whichever way. At some stage I'll just, like when time is up, I'll stop and I can come back here or we can discuss later. Okay, so all I wanted to say was that you have this diffeomorphism invariant measure, and there are various crazy things which happen here. It's not all smooth sailing. For example, the kinematic Hilbert space is non-separable. Okay, if you solve the diffeomorphism constraint, you get well-defined separable sectors, but you start off with some. I mean, there's lots of stuff. So I can tell you later how all this works. In any case, you have all spatial diffeomorphisms are represented unitarily on this kinematic Hilbert space of square integrable functions of connections with respect to this measure. Okay, now let's go to the quantum dynamics. So the dynamics along the spatial slice is generated by the diffeomorphism constraint, and classically this just, you can check, it just generates spatial diffeomorphisms of the data, and since these diffeomorphisms are represented unitarily, it turns out that the kernel of the diffeomorphism constraint can be actually constructed. And really the main problem is the dynamics which is normal to the slice and how to define it. This is really the key open issue, and this is where all maybe, all various ambiguities, I wouldn't call them ultraviolet ambiguity, I'm not sure what they are, but there are lots of ambiguities which come in, so let me just get to those. So I need to construct essentially the Hamiltonian constraint operator. So I just, I want to take some version of this Hamiltonian constraint, integrate it with the lapse and get some operator over here. So here there is a problem, and the problem is that the Hamiltonian constraint depends on local fields like the connection, whereas our basic connection operators are non-local holonomies. So they depend on edges and on loops and so on and so forth. So basically I need to construct the connection operator from the holonomies. Classically there's no problem, because what I can do is I can just take the holonomy of some small edge in some coordinate system, and then in the limit in which this edge shrinks to 0, I can just massage this guy and get out the connection. But quantum mechanically there's a problem, because the measure is diffeomorphism invariant, so it can't tell the difference really between a big edge, a big edge and a small edge and a smaller edge. So if you look at the quantum theory, the operator limit is not defined. So you actually don't have connection operators, you only have holonomy operators. The analog of this in the mini superspace, or what's the analog of this in quantum mechanics? So in quantum mechanics you have the Stone-von Neumann theorem, everything is unique, etc. So but the representation one uses is actually different from the usual representation, and the reason is something similar to this. The Stone-von Neumann theorem works when these sort of exponentiated Weyl algebra elements are weakly continuous in the parameters, and here you give up weak continuity. So similarly, this is like the exponential of the connection which is defined, but the connection is not defined. And that is, if you like, the key difference with other representations. Okay, let me go ahead. So basically, this is a problem. I don't know how to define connection operators, whereas I need them. So now this is where things become, yeah. Yes. Yeah, I wouldn't call it topology because there are local degrees of freedom, but yes, essentially the more trivial part of the dynamics is what you've taken care of rigorously, and the non-trivial part of the dynamics is the one where you are basically, that is the area of research which I do. So, yeah. Yeah, so it's very difficult to fix a global gauge in gravity. One could do that, and then one would have to worry, firstly, whether a gauge is a good gauge, whether you get all configurations, including initial data for black holes, initial data for waves, initial data for cosmologies. And then secondly, you'd also have to worry about whether, one can do certain gauge fixings, but then the whole thing becomes extremely intractable. So there are families of gauges which people use. There's the so-called York gauge, where you use the trace of the extrinsic curvature as time. In the asymptotically flat case, you can use maximal slices, which are basically trace k equal to 0 slices. But again, when you can make some progress in solving some parts of the diffeomorphism constraint, there are some elliptic equations which you can solve. But then the Hamiltonian constraint is really an unholy mess, and you don't know what to do with it. Right. So in this, for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to consider compact spaces without boundary. Another open area is how to do the asymptotically flat case. No, it's not easier because it's this whole damn problem of how you get smooth metrics out of this thing. So what you want are asymptotic boundary conditions to be satisfied, which presume that you can make contact with some smooth spatial metric at infinity. And again, there are ideas how to do this. But maybe let me relegate that to, because the kind of excitations you get are very discrete excitations of spatial geometry. And yeah, exactly, at infinity, right. Yeah. So I'll come to, yeah. So I think, the theory is really not as developed as you'd like it to be. And so I'm just coming there, and there are all these open issues which people have to look at, and people are trying their best to, well, I don't know if they're trying their best, but there are these things which have to be taken care of. So let me proceed. I have probably some negative time, or I don't know, 0. So what do you want me to do? Okay, I'll try and sort of rush through quickly. Because this is really the meat. I mean, the identity, actually, it's not maybe perhaps that interesting for all of you. Okay, so here, what is the strategy? This is where things become ugly. Right? So what you do is you consider, now you start imposing ad hoc and external elements. And this is where everything, all this nice stuff which you don't have any background and so on, it starts getting hairy and ugly, and I want to know what a way out of this ugliness is. Let me just proceed right now. So you just consider some triangulation of the manifold. You divide sigma into coordinate cells of size delta cube, for example. Within each cell, you have small loops, you have small surfaces, just like, for example, in lattice gauge theory, you approximate local quantities in the Hamiltonian constraint to order delta by holonomies and suitable triad functions. It's all classical. So you obtain some approximant in each cell, which I'll call hi, to the Hamiltonian constraint in that cell, and then approximate the integral h of n by a sum with values of the laps over here, and you replace functions. Now, these approximants to the connection and to the triad are in terms of small loop holonomies and small surface fluxes, okay? So now you have an expression which is an approximate expression in terms of holonomies and fluxes, and in that expression, one replaces these functions. So of course, I can take the delta going to 0 limit classically and I get back the Hamiltonian constraint. The whole problem is quantum mechanically. I replace these finite triangulation guys by corresponding operators and I get some finite triangulation Hamiltonian constraint, and then I need to take the delta going to 0 limit. And so the hope is that while the individual operator approximants don't have the limit, that's what I just told you, the connection operators are not defined, it might be that this conglomeration of all these operators which define the Hamiltonian constraint actually do have a limit in some suitable operator topology. And Thiemann was able to construct such a continuum operator, but it turns out that the operator action depends on the choices which you made at finite triangulation, such as, some diffeomorphism invariant choices, like what is the shape of the edge, is the edge sort of twisting around your spin network state or not, is it circular, is it jagged, all those things go in over here, and so there is actually an infinite ambiguity of regularization, which you would see in other quantum field theory contexts, and they appear here, except that there's no metric background. One is, so I hesitate to call them ultraviolet, but in any case, the whole point is that there's a lot of ambiguity in defining this Hamiltonian constraint, and so the idea is then to confront any candidate operator with physical requirements. And one such requirement is that the dynamics generated by the operator be space-time covariant. So let me now go to a brief digression on what space-time covariance is and how it appears in the Hamiltonian theory. So this is quite pretty, and it's sort of standalone from, whether the other stuff is there or not. This is a nice old piece of work by Kukash, Hodgman, and Teitelbaum. I don't get anywhere else, I'd like to at least tell you this. So a theory is space-time covariant if its solutions, for my purposes, if its solutions describe space-time geometries. So for example, GR is manifestly space-time covariant because you have the Einstein equations, which are equations for space-time metrics. The Hamiltonian formulation of GR is also space-time covariant because it describes a space-time covariant theory. It's just that the space-time metric is now just butchered into three-dimensional objects, and the primary variables are then evolving three-dimensional objects. So space-time covariance is not as explicit as in the Lagrangian formulation. And this raises the following general question. Supposing I give you a Hamiltonian formulation of some theory, how do I know, just looking at that Hamiltonian formulation, that it is actually the Hamiltonian formulation of a space-time covariant theory? And so, in other words, does any structure in the Hamiltonian formulation of a space-time covariant theory acquire a characteristic form deriving from space-time covariance? And the answer, due to Hodgman, Kukash, and Teitelbaum a long time ago, is in the affirmative. And it turns out that it's exactly the Poisson bracket algebra between the generators of evolution which obtains some characteristic form. I don't know, because I don't know, I've never studied the Peierls bracket in any detail. Could be, could be. I think Don Marolf tried for a long time to do things with the Peierls bracket, and probably it's ongoing. It just seemed extremely complicated, whatever he's trying to do. But I have no idea what that's about. So, something I'm ignoring. Okay, so what is the idea of this HKT proof. So they start off with the fact that the Hamiltonian formulation of any theory of space-time geometry, if you want to talk about Hamiltonian formulation, better have a topology sigma cross R. And as in GR, evolution pushes sigma, the spatial slice, along the time flow and generates the whole space-time. So now what they do is they consider infinitesimal, normal and tangential displacements of sigma in the space-time metric GAB, okay? So you have normal and tangential guys over here. And you can work out, this is just geometry, you can work out the algebra of deformations of the hypersurface, tangential to itself and normal to itself. So you have tangential, tangential gives you tangential, normal, tangential gives you normal, normal, normal gives you tangential, with in a direction which depends on the 3 metric induced by this 4 metric. So this has nothing to do with your particular theory. Any space-time covariant theory will have to move your slices inside the ambient space-time, and therefore the algebra of generators of evolution had better follow this structure. And this implies that the Poisson bracket between evolution generators must also have this structure. And for example, in GR, you can check that GR Poisson brackets are actually a representation of this structure. So in the classical theory, space-time covariance implies this characteristic Poisson bracket structure, and if we want some sort of a space-time structure to emerge in the quantum theory, where you have completely butchered things into space and time, then one would like to impose the condition that this completely non-trivial space Poisson bracket algebra be represented in quantum theory. Right? And I just refer to this condition as some quantum space-time covariance condition, and I just want to say that this is an extremely non-trivial requirement, because I really don't know much about any other treatments which have, structure functions in the algebra. Okay, so the idea is that you confront whatever is your favorite Hamiltonian constraint definition by this space-time covariance requirement. So again, what you want is the Poisson bracket between Hamiltonian constraints in the classical theory, give you this thing with structure functions. And so in quantum theory, you want the commutator to give you something like this. Now, if you look in, I'm almost finishing up. Maybe if you give me 2 minutes, I'll just wind up. So, so let's look at what this means in LQG. On the left, you have 2 Hamiltonian constraints. I already told you that to define a Hamiltonian constraint operator, you need to first go to a finite triangulation and then shrink that triangulation away. So you have 2 triangulations, one with this operator, one with this operator, and you need to shrink both of them away. On the right-hand side, you have just one operator, and so just one, presumably just one finite triangulation limit. And what you need to do is to somehow make choices over here such that the continuum left-hand side is equal to the continuum right-hand side. And it's already a very, very complicated game, and it would be much easier to analyze what this requirement means if the right-hand side also was structurally similar to the left-hand side. And so the question one can ask is, can the right-hand side also be written as a commutator of 2 operators, because then one would have 2 triangulations over there, and one would more easily be able to hone in on the right choices. So now the right-hand side is actually a diffeomorphism, and so can it be written as the commutator of 2 diffeomorphisms? And the classical precursor of this question is, of course, can we write the classical right-hand side as the Poisson bracket between 2 diffeomorphisms? So one looks for a new Poisson bracket identity where the classical right-hand side is given by Poisson bracket of some things. So what can, these some things have to have shifts in them. What can these shifts possibly be? Well, given the lapses on the left-hand side, one can define what I call electric shifts, which is just a combination of m times the triad field. So you get a triplet of shifts here, a triplet of shifts here. And clearly this cannot be done with the metric variables. Okay, so this is where the triads enter crucially. And the new identity basically relates diffeomorphisms by these Q number shifts, these electric shifts, the Poisson brackets between them to the Hamiltonian constraint Poisson bracket over here. Okay, so this is the final result, that you have this new identity between diffeomorphism constraints related to Hamiltonian constraints. And since LQG handles spatial diffeomorphisms well, there's some hope that one can proceed in honing in on the right choice of the Hamiltonian constraint operator using this sort of an identity in quantum theory. But it also suggests the following question: can we write this is only the Poisson brackets between 2 Hamiltonian constraints. Can we actually write the evolution itself on the primary fields, the connection and the triad, in terms of such diffeomorphisms? And again, indications are that this is not hopeless. So I did some calculations with actually the self-dual variables. But again, this is sort of a detailed story which one can talk about later. So just to summarize, some of my research is focused on the issue of the Hamiltonian constraint in LQG. There are many choices which go, many choices of this operator, and one would like to restrict these choices through non-trivial requirements. And one such choice is space-time covariance, as I just discussed. There are other requirements. For example, people have sort of said that the earlier constraints do not actually, in their kernel, have physical states which encode propagation effects. So I'm trying to address this as well. One extremely important requirement, I mean, the sort of where the theory can be discarded or the theory can be, taken to be serious, is whether the emergent space-time is locally Lorentz invariant or not. I don't even know how to formulate this at this sort of raw stage of the theory, but this is really, to me, the most important question. Even if one can say that the answer is negative, then that's progress. One can just shut things down. If it's positive, then I think this is a very good candidate for the theory of quantum gravity. So yeah, progress is slow, but I think there is some progress. So thanks a lot for your attention.